Hey guys, so today we're going to be talking about the third trend of the 1920s, which is the trend of clashing values. And this is going to be the biggest one that we're looking at here. So you should have a worksheet that on one side says Trend 3, Clashing Values. It's got Prohibition, Women, and Science versus Religion. Then on the other side, it should say Clashing Values Continued, African Americans. Okay, so that's what we've got here. So as we start talking about these different values, it's important to know what the values are that we're talking about. So specifically, we're talking about this idea of the traditional America versus more modern America. So in traditional America, think more like the conservative politics that we talked about last week, people who kind of want to do things the way that they were before World War I. And then we have the younger generation who are doing things a little bit differently from that. This more modern idea, you'll hear like the idea of the modern woman in this time period as part of that. And a lot of this is very farm versus city, right? So this is rural versus urban. In fact, this is the first time in history that the rural population is lower than the urban population, which means that for the first time in American history, there are more people living in cities than there are people living in the country. That is a trend that will continue for the rest of American history and is still true today. So if you look at this chart down here, you can see that this is the first time that happens. It actually starts a little bit before the 20s, but the trend really keeps on increasing during this time period. So let's go ahead and jump right in and see what some of those clashing values are. The first one is prohibition, right? So we already have talked a little bit about the old ideas of prohibition. This is mostly a movement started by women, and it actually starts as early as the 1820s. And the idea here, and this is the idea that pretty much all of these prohibition, for lack of a better word, people were really saying is that alcohol is the root of all social problems. You would also hear these people are called teetotalers. Billy Sunday was actually a guy who was a former alcoholic who turned into a preacher, and he kind of became one of the big proponents of this idea that alcohol is the root of the social problems. And so, in the early 1900s, prohibitionists were successful in getting the 18th Amendment passed. So the 18th Amendment, as we've talked about before, is the Prohibition Amendment. And specifically what that says is there is no longer in this country to be the sale, transport, or consumption of alcohol. You can't buy it, you can't move it, you can't drink it, right? Well, let's just be honest. Do you really think people are going to be that willing to give up their alcohol just because a new constitutional amendment has been passed? Well, of course not. In fact, in the 20s, the consumption of alcohol increases dramatically. Basically, there's this new idea that alcohol is part of this new city life, this new urban life in like New York and some of the other bigger cities, Chicago, these big cities in the day. And the enforcement for these things is not there. The police are just as unwilling as anybody else to give up their alcohol, so they're not really enforcing a lot of this. This is going to lead to the development of a lot of kind of underhanded illegal stuff going on in the country. So first of all, you might have heard of a speakeasy. So speakeasy are kind of like these secret bars. So maybe like some guy that runs a speakeasy, he owns a laundromat, right? So the first floor is just a legitimate business. It's a laundromat business. But you go up to the guy at the counter and you say, I heard you got a special washing machine in the back, right? And he'll lead you to this secret door. Knock on the secret door. What's the password? Password is William Harding's got a big bag, right? Well, if you say the right password, they'll let you in. And then you go down into the speakeasy, and that's where there's going to be jazz and drinking and partying and dancing. So these would kind of pop up in underground places all over the city, and they might be at a different spot every night. This also leads to bootlegging. So bootlegging are basically smugglers of alcohol. Our very first NASCAR racing comes from guys who learned how to soup up their cars to go faster than the cop cars, so they could transport alcohol all over the country, and that was pretty big in the South. This is also going to lead to a rise in organized crime. So if they can't buy it legally, they're going to turn to buying it illegally. So this leads to kind of like the rise of the stereotypical mafia, the gangster story. You're probably familiar with Al Capone. He was the mob boss in Chicago, and he seemed squeaky clean, right? Like they couldn't make anything stick to Al Capone. And he was the center of a major crime ring that was all about getting alcohol into the city of Chicago. So just some photographs here that we've got. So this is just one of those posters of someone who is for Prohibition. This picture is actually from a film, but this might be kind of something that the speakeasy, what that might look like. And it's kind of this fear that people said, this is going to be the root of all the social problems. But it's really the effect of organized crime that's the major issue. So this particular photograph is of a pretty brutal massacre called the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. And this was kind of a massacre that was between one of Al Capone's major rivals and supposedly the police. Except when they did the forensics, and this is one of the first trials that uses real forensics, they realized that the guns that were used to kill these men were not police guns. And it was probably Al Capone who ordered the hit. But they couldn't make it stick to Al Capone, so they actually get Al Capone on tax evasion, not organized crime. So that's the only thing they could make stick to him, was that he wasn't paying his taxes. But that's what got him in jail. And so really, this idea that Prohibition is going to lead to the increase or the decrease in crime and social problems, the complete opposite happened. Alcohol became even more of a cultural phenomenon than it did before the 20s. By 1933, America realizes they made a really big mistake. First of all, illegal alcohol is being sold all over the country. But guess what? Nobody's paying taxes on it because it's illegal. So the United States government isn't getting a cut of this. Not to mention that it's actually, because it's illegal, it's making things worse, right? So in 1933, in order to get the tax revenue back from alcohol, and because Prohibition's not working, they passed a new constitutional amendment, the 21st Amendment in 1933, overturned the sale of alcohol, or the Prohibition Amendment. The only time in our nation's history that an amendment has been overturned. So that's the first of these new ideas. The second is the change in ideas for women. So in terms of the older ideas, in traditional areas of the country, in these rural areas of the country, a lot of this doesn't really change. But the idea is that a woman had household duties that she needed to fulfill. A lot of women went to work during the war, but they said, well, once your men come home, give up your jobs, go back to your home, be a wife, be a mom. And a lot of these rural women who had worked during the war did. But there's also this double standard in the country where men can do one thing that women are not allowed to do. Or it's this idea that, men can go out and drink, but if a woman goes out and drinks, then that's a bad thing, right? Or men can sleep around and do whatever they want, but if a woman does that, well, then she's a scarlet woman, right? So there's this double standard for women. And a lot of the younger women in the 20s don't really like this idea. So the new idea of the modern woman gets the nickname the flapper. So you may wonder why women of this time get this nickname. And we'll talk about why that is in just a second. But at first, this was meant to be kind of a derogatory term. But the women in the time really took it on themselves as a badge of honor. So they changed the kind of clothes that they wore. Rather than wearing skirts that went all the way to the ground, that might wear short skirts, maybe even pants, right? Ooh, that's scandalous for a woman wearing pants. You can see both of her legs. Shocking. So they changed their clothes. They changed their hair, right? So during the 20s, the short bob is the popular cut during the time period. A lot of these women were unwilling to give up the jobs they had had during the war, whether it was a secretarial position or working as a teacher or whatever. They didn't want to give up those jobs. There's also the passage of the 19th Amendment, which means that women now have voting rights. And a lot of these women, they don't want to give up that, right? They want to be involved in politics. They want to be involved in society. So there's these changes and these new ideas for women, and this really starts to change the attitude and the social norms for women. Whereas before, it wouldn't have been okay to see women at a party. Now women can go out and, dance and drink and smoke just like anybody else, right? So that's kind of what's going on in the 20s. You can see over here, these are just some pictures of these women. They've got in their short knee-length skirts, which may not seem short to us, but in the 20s, when you were wearing skirts down to your ankles, that was a big deal. And you can see how they've got their kind of legs kicked up there. This is where they got their nickname from. So let me give you just a little demonstration. So there's a new dance style in the 20s that's pretty popular, and that dance style is the Charleston. So you notice how my arms kind of flap a little bit and how my legs kind of kick up, right? That's the new dance style of the 20s, and it kind of made women look a little flappish, right? Or like a flapper. They're flapping their arms, kicking up their legs. So the 20s has become this idea where women now can open up and become more themselves, become the modern woman, right? So that's kind of the new big deal in this time. The last one that we're going to talk about before we move on to the back is science versus religion. And this really gets its root in what's called the Scopes monkey trial. Excuse me. So the Scopes trial was a trial that was held in Tennessee. And it may seem like a weird name, right? The monkey trial. What's this all about? So let's talk a little bit about what's going on with this here. So in Tennessee, there's a new theory, or it's not really a new theory. Theory's been around for a while. But there's this new idea that in schools, in teaching science, that Darwin's evolutionary theory should be taught in public schools. This was a really radical idea at the time. People didn't want to teach it, right? They thought that maybe it would go against religion, right? And a lot of the religion kind of got a new upswing after World War I, particularly fundamentalist religion, which means really strong conservative religion. And they really thought that creationism should be taught in schools, the idea that God created the world, okay? And this is what was being taught in a lot of schools all over the country, in most schools. And so they decided, a group of people who wanted to test what would happen if they taught evolution, got this guy to start teaching evolution. He was a teacher in Tennessee, right? His name was Scopes. The problem is, in Tennessee, it was illegal to teach evolution. So Scopes, he's kind of the test, right? And he agrees to do this. It's not like he was being tricked into this. But Scopes decides he's going to start teaching evolution in his class. In 1925, he is arrested for teaching evolutionary theory. His lawyer is a guy named Clarence Darrow, and he's going to defend that Scopes had the right to teach this theory in his classes. Now, the state hires a man named William Jennings Bryan. That name sounds a little familiar. So William Jennings Bryan goes on to defend a lot of these rural values. He was a very strong Christian guy. Remember, he's the guy that gave the Cross of Gold speech, right? So he is going to defend these old fundamentalist religion ideas. Scopes is found guilty because technically it was against the law, and he was fined $100 for this. But really what this did is opens up this debate in our country about what we should be teaching with these new modern ideas of science versus religion, right? So you see this picture here, William Jennings Bryan is the guy on the right. Clarence Darrow is the guy on the left there. This is a picture of Scopes himself, so the young man who was the teacher who taught this. And it really does change kind of the way the world viewed evolutionary theory and creationism. It was a big deal as we're looking through this here. So these photographs, the top photograph is a picture from the trial. The bottom photograph there is a picture of the Anti-Evolution League. It's a headquarters that says the conflict, hell in the high school. Basically saying if we teach about evolution, we're going to send all our high school kids to hell, right? Because they're going to stop believing in God and all of this. And that's kind of that rural traditional or rural urban clash that we see here in terms of this. So go ahead and flip over to the back of your worksheet. We're going to look at the last group here, which is the changing of values for African Americans in this time period. And that really roots in something called the Harlem Renaissance, and it stems from the Great Migration. So this quote here is a woman named Zora Neale Hurston, who was a writer of the Harlem Renaissance. And it describes the Great Migration, where she says, "Some said goodbye cheerfully, others fearfully, with terrors of unknown dangers in their mouths. Others, in their eagerness for distance, said nothing. The daybreak found them gone. The wind said north." Right? So let's take a look here at what some of the changes were for African American culture. So let's think back to how African Americans were treated in the South in the beginning of the 1900s. So a lot of them are unable to vote because of the literacy tests and the poll taxes that are put into place. There's obviously a lack of respect. They are treated as second-class citizens, even violence against them with segregation and lynching, the KKK being very strong in that part of the country. And a lot of African Americans really felt that if they moved north, things would change for them. And we'll see if that really kind of is the way it was or not. A couple people during this idea who brought out some new ideas for African Americans. First, the NAACP is founded, and you may remember W.E.B. Du Bois. He's going to be a major leader of the NAACP, and they protest a lot of the racial violence that was going on, a lot of the lynching that we talked about. In 1919, one of the members, a guy named James Weldon Johnson, who is going to go on to be a writer in this period, they try to force some legislation through to protect African American rights, particularly anti-lynching laws to be passed in the South. However, the NAACP kind of gets a bad reputation because they're seen as pretty militant, pretty forceful. And the idea behind this was, we've got to be forceful in order to get anything done. However, a lot of people in white society began to fear the NAACP, and they weren't really open to listening to what they were saying. This guy down here, you may see down at the bottom, there's a guy down here in a funny hat. He's another guy that had some new ideas during this time period. His name is Marcus Garvey. So Marcus Garvey founds an organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association, okay, or the UNIA. So Marcus Garvey was an immigrant from Jamaica, but he had traveled kind of all over the world. And what he realized in his travels is that African Americans were treated like crap everywhere. Black people were treated like crap in any part of the world, whether it was North America, whether it was in Europe, Australia, Jamaica itself. And he really supported this Black nationalist movement, okay, where he basically said, if we want to be treated like equals, we need to have a separate society. So he didn't want to integrate. He actually wanted to segregate because he wanted to have societies of only Black people, right, where only Black people lived together. And he said, where better for Black people to congregate than in Africa, where we are from. So he starts a movement known as the Back to Africa movement, where he's trying to get Black people to move back to Africa and form these separate societies away from white people in Africa. And he does get some support. The problem is turns out he was also really bad at paying taxes. He is deported and eventually arrested. And after he goes to jail, his movement kind of wears away. He kind of got more radical. Some people started to think that he was kind of a little crazy. So he lost a lot of his followers because they kind of thought he was a little nuts. But he did start to promote this new and very different idea of African Americans for African Americans in this time period. And this, of course, is going to lead to the Harlem Renaissance. So this is just a short little poem here called I Too by Langston Hughes. And it's a great poem that really emphasizes the Harlem Renaissance here. So instead of reading it to you, I'm going to have somebody with a much better voice read it. So here we go.
I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh, and I eat well, and I grow strong. Tomorrow I'll sit at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I, too, am America.
So this is a great poem to really emphasize what the goals of the Harlem Renaissance really were. So I too am America, right? As a black man, I am the darker brother. I am the brother of America, right? I am an American, but they send me to eat at the table and eat in the kitchen when company comes, right? So he's saying that one day I will be accepted as the darker brother, as part of America, because I too am America. Langston Hughes is probably one of the most well-known poets to come out of this period, and really emphasizes, as I said, what this movement is really all about. So the Harlem Renaissance is a literary and artistic movement, right? The idea is that we really want to celebrate Black and African culture. Harlem becomes known as the capital of Black America. So James Weldon Johnson, I mentioned him just a second ago, he says this pretty famous quote where he says, "Harlem is not merely a Negro colony or community. It is a city within a city and the greatest Negro city in the world. It is not a slum or a fringe. It is located in the heart of Manhattan and occupies one of the most beautiful sections of the city." So what he says is that people flock to Harlem to really be a part of this movement, right? It comes from the Great Migration. It's where a lot of African Americans moved as part of the Great Migration for these new jobs. And as they're there, they're really trying to find their own culture, right? Their own artistic license and who they are. So we're going to talk about three major parts of the Harlem Renaissance. That's literary, jazz, music, and art, okay? So the first is the writers or the authors of this period. So a lot of these guys are well-educated, middle-class African Americans. This is a photograph of Langston Hughes down here. You see he's very well-dressed. These are people who have gotten that education. W.E.B. Du Bois would call them the talented 10th. Right? And what they're doing is they're writing about the pride of the African American experience. A lot of them go back to like African heritage, so you can see a lot of African influences. They write a lot about what it's like to be Black in a world that is so white, right? And what problems they encounter and the racism and segregation and the violence that they encounter as part of that. Some of the major people of this time period are Zora Neale Hurston, the African-American woman from Florida, and she kind of writes about what it's like to be a poor Southern Black. So her most famous book, Their Eyes Are Watching God, talks about African Americans in South Florida and what that's like for them there and kind of what they face. We talked a little bit about Langston Hughes. He writes mostly poetry. And he writes about what it's like to be part of the working class, so these people who moved up from the South to work in factories. His writing is very much influenced by jazz. It's got this kind of tempo that's syncopated almost, and you could hear that in the way that that I too am America. They will send me to eat at the table when company comes, but they will laugh. But you know, that kind of idea, right? Where it's got almost this musical tempo to it. And jazz was a big part of African American culture. Jazz began in New Orleans, and the original part of jazz was blending ragtime and blues. So ragtime, we talked a little bit about that at the turn of the century. Blues was very much influenced by old slave spirituals and that sort of thing. And so in New Orleans, they kind of blend those two musical styles to come up with jazz. So some of the famous people that we look at here, first we have Louis Armstrong or Louis Armstrong. He really believed in like improvising. That's kind of the core of what jazz is that there's no written music. You just kind of express yourself personally, and this is something he really is kind of the proponent of. Louis Armstrong, you may know him best as the singer, but he was actually a cornet player. Cornet's kind of like a trumpet, and so that's what he was very well known for at the time. Then we have Duke Ellington. He led the orchestra at the Cotton Club in New York City, and he was a composer. Some of the most famous big band music, like It Don't Mean a Thing If It Ain't Got That Swing, that comes from Duke Ellington. The last one that I have here is Bessie Smith. So this is a photograph of Bessie Smith here. She gets the nickname the Empress goddess of blues. She had a very sultry, kind of deep voice that was very popular for both whites and blacks in the period. And she actually becomes one of the highest paid musicians in the world, especially black musician, but even of white musicians as well. And jazz really becomes popular in all parts of communities, like I said, both white and black communities. And there is kind of this development of jazz through the years, but really the key here again is this idea of improvisation. There is a lot of like African influence there, the call and respond kind of thing, where like one musician will play one thing and the other musician will respond to it. That's a big part of African music, so that's a part of this as well. The last one that we're going to look at here is art. So like the rest of the Harlem Renaissance, artists of this period are really trying to find a unique and individual style. They're very much influenced by a type of art called Cubism, which developed in France. Cubism itself was actually influenced by African art, and so you can kind of see that nice trend. This picture down at the bottom is a really good example of Cubism, where it's very geometric, right? Where the shapes are, you can really point out like there's a circle, there's a square. It's not as natural, right? A lot of African American art is very much centered on city or urban life. It's centered around jazz. Jazz plays a big role in it, that kind of flowy improvisation kind of thing. A couple major artists of this time are Romare Bearden and Jacob Lawrence. Romare Bearden actually has a lot of influence from North Carolina, which I think is pretty cool. So just to look at some of these pictures just to see what they were like. First of all, you can see that a lot of the shapes, like I was saying, part of Cubism here, but this obviously does have a lot of influence as part of African culture. And again, remember, part of the art is trying to find a very unique black style, right? And so part of that is to look back at African heritage and what's influenced, right? So this is very primal, very basic, right? But you can see a lot of those influences in pictures like this as well. This is a Bearden painting, and you can see, first of all, there's the jazz right off the bat. It's kind of mixed media, where it doesn't look like a straight up painting. It looks like there's like photographs or whatever in it. A lot of color, a lot of kind of not realistic style, right? And then finally, this is just a photograph of, or a painting of a city. It's probably Harlem, and you can see like the major parts of the city that they have here, the bars, the churches, the dance halls, the funeral homes, the beauty parlors. You can see the billboards in the background that's got different advertising on it, people on the street, and it's again something that's meant to be a very African style, African American style. So this kind of wraps up our look at the clashing values here. So we will pick up in class and kind of going more in depth into some of this culture, and I will see you then. Bye-bye.